Have you ever made a life-changing breakthrough in therapy that you deeply regret? I've been seeing Dr. Foreman for 6 months now, trying to figure out how to find my parents' killer. I remember his face perfectly. I was 7 when it happened, hiding in the closet, watching him stab them through the crack in the door. Gray hair, tall, scar on his left hand from where my mother had fought back. I've told the police everything 100 times, but without a name or location, they can't do anything. The sketch has been in the system for 20 years, I told Dr. Foreman during our Thanksgiving afternoon session. No matches. It's like he just vanished. Edwin, you're doing everything you can, she said. Sometimes these things take time. The detective called yesterday, said they're moving my case to the cold files. 20 years is their limit for active investigation. My voice cracked. I watch true crime shows where DNA solves 30-year-old cases, but we have nothing. He wore gloves. He was careful. I just keep thinking, what if I saw him at a grocery store? Would I even recognize him after all these years? People age, change. Maybe we should go out together sometime, she joked. 2 sets of eyes are better than 1. We'll find your parents' killer at Whole Foods buying organic kale. I managed a small laugh. It was nice that she tried to lighten the mood, but I still had no idea why she was really trying to lighten the mood. She'd been the only person in 20 years who didn't look at me with pity when I talked about still searching. The session ended and she checked her phone. Oh no. My Uber canceled. 3rd one today. Surge pricing is insane. I can drive you wherever you need to go. That's sweet, but it's against professional boundaries. I'm already late for my family's Thanksgiving. You just spent your holiday listening to me talk about murder. Let me at least drive you. She hesitated, looking at her phone again. The next available car is 40 minutes away. I need to stop at the store first. I promised to bring pie, and if I don't show up with it, my mother will never let me hear the end of it. No problem. At the supermarket, she ran in while I waited. The parking lot was nearly empty. Most people were already at their dinners. When she came back, she was balancing 2 pies and looked frazzled. They only had sugar-free pumpkin left, so I grabbed apple too. My dad's diabetic, but he'll eat the regular anyway and blame us for letting him. She gave me directions to a nice suburban neighborhood, the kind with basketball hoops in driveways and those little library boxes on lawns. Big family? I asked. Parents, siblings, cousins, chaos, she laughed. My dad always makes enough food for an army, says it's because he grew up poor and promised himself his kids would never see an empty table. When we pulled up to the 2-story colonial with warm light spilling from every window, she paused. Edwin, I know this is unconventional, but would you like to come in? No one should be alone on Thanksgiving. That's really crossing boundaries. I won't mention you're my patient, just a friend who helped me out. Besides, you could use a normal Thanksgiving after everything you've been through. When's the last time you had one? In hindsight, I should have screamed, should have turned around and ran to the police, but the loneliness of 20 Thanksgivings without my parents overwhelmed me. Okay, thanks, I replied. The house was warm, full of laughter and football sounds. Kids ran around with toy planes. The smell of turkey and sage hit me like a physical memory. It felt like the family gatherings I barely remembered from childhood before everything went dark. Everyone, this is Edwin, Dr. Foreman announced. He saved me from being stranded. Her mom immediately hugged me, smelling like cinnamon and butter. Oh, bless you. Leslie's always missing dinner because of those apps. Stay. We have so much food. People shook my hand, pressed drinks into my palm, asked about my life. A little girl showed me her drawings. Someone's grandfather started telling me about his time in Korea. It was overwhelming but nice, like being absorbed into something warm and alive. Dad, come meet Edwin. Doctor, Foreman called toward the kitchen. He's the one who saved my pies. The pies are saved? Thank God your mother would have killed us both, a voice boomed back. A man walked out drying his hands on a dish towel. Tall, even at what must be 70 now. Gray hair, though he must have been younger 20 years ago, maybe 50 then. The kitchen light caught his left hand as he dried it. The scar on his left hand, jagged, old, running from his thumb to his wrist. My body went cold, then hot. The room started spinning. 20 years of staring at that scar in my nightmares, drawing it for police sketches, describing its exact curve and length. The defensive wound my mother had given him when she'd grabbed her own knife. Nice to meet you, he said, extending that scarred hand. Bob Foreman, thanks for helping my Leslie out. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Just stared at the scar I described to police 10,000 times. Edwin? Doctor. Foreman touched my arm. Are you okay? You look pale. I pulled out my phone with trembling fingers, found the photo of the police sketch I always kept, the one I'd shown her dozens of times in therapy, held it up with shaking hands. It's him, I whispered. Dr. Foreman's voice sounds like it's coming from underwater, asking if I'm okay, but I can't make my mouth work to answer. My whole body feels frozen except for my hands, which won't stop shaking as I stare at that scar. Bob takes a step toward me with concern on his face, and I finally snap out of it. I mumble something about feeling sick, needing air, sorry, and I turn toward the front door. People are watching me stumble through the living room, and I hear Doctor Foreman calling my name behind me, but I just keep moving. My legs feel weak and my vision is blurry, but I make it outside into the cold November air. I fumble with my car keys for what feels like forever before I can get the door unlocked. Once I'm inside, I lock all the doors and sit there shaking so hard my teeth are chattering. My hands are trembling as I pull out my phone and find the police sketch I always keep saved. I hold it up and compare it to the mental image I just burned into my brain from seeing Bob. The scar matches perfectly, that jagged line from thumb to wrist on the left hand. The height matches, he's tall even at 70. The gray hair, the way he held himself, even his voice sounds familiar now that I think about it. Everything matches the man from my nightmares, the man I watched kill my parents 20 years ago. I start the car and drive away from that house as fast as I can without breaking traffic laws. 3 blocks later, I have to pull over because I'm shaking too badly to see the road straight. I'm in some random neighborhood parking lot, and I grab my notebook from the glove compartment with trembling fingers. I start writing down every single detail I can remember before I forget anything. What Bob was wearing, a blue sweater and khaki pants. His exact words when he introduced himself. The way he dried his hands on that dish towel before extending his scarred hand to shake mine. The precise location of the scar, starting at the base of his thumb and running diagonally across his palm to his wrist. The color of it, that old white scar tissue that stands out against his skin. I write for 10 minutes straight without stopping, filling 3 pages with observations. Then I take photos of my police sketch from multiple angles and start a new document on my phone with today's date and time. I type out everything again, wanting multiple copies in case something happens to my notebook. For the next 2 hours, I just sit in that parking lot going through every memory of my therapy sessions with Dr. Foreman. I told her everything about the case, described that scar in detail at least a dozen times, showed her the police sketch over and over. Did I give her enough information that she should have recognized her own father? The scar is so distinctive. How could she not notice it on her dad's hand? My phone keeps buzzing with texts from her. The first one asks if I'm okay. The second says she's worried. The third says everyone at dinner is concerned and asking about me. I stare at the messages, but I can't make myself respond because I don't know what to say. Did she know all along that her father killed my parents? Is that why she invited me to Thanksgiving, to see what I would do when I saw him? My brain keeps spinning with these questions, but I have no answers. I silence my phone and keep reviewing my memories, trying to remember if she ever reacted strangely when I talked about the scar or the killer's description. Around midnight, I finally drive home because I'm exhausted and freezing in my car. But once I get to my apartment, I can't sleep. I'm too wired. I spend the rest of the night researching Bob Foreman online. I find his Facebook profile and scroll through years of family photos. I find his address, the same house I just fled from. I find his work history on LinkedIn and see he used to work for a plumbing supply company. My hands are still shaking as I open Google Maps and start creating a detailed timeline. I mark where my childhood home was, where Bob's old job was located, where he lived 20 years ago. I screenshot everything and save it all to a folder on my computer. I find social media profiles for his wife, his other kids, trying to piece together his whole life. By 4 in the morning, I have pages of notes and a map showing his known locations over the past 20 years. At 4 in the morning, I'm so tired my eyes are burning, but I know I need to contact the police while everything is fresh in my mind. I find the old email address for Detective Harrison, the officer who originally handled my parents' case before it went cold. I start drafting an email, and it takes me an hour to get it right. I attach the police sketch, multiple photos of Bob Foreman from his social media, my detailed notes about the scar, and a full account of how I met him at Thanksgiving dinner. I explain that this is the man from my memory, and I'm absolutely certain even after 20 years. The scar matches perfectly, he's the right height and age, and he had opportunity because he worked in my neighborhood. I read the email 5 times before I finally hit send at 5 in the morning. Then I try to sleep, but my brain won't shut off. I keep seeing Bob's face every time I close my eyes. That friendly smile as he dried his hands, the way he extended that scarred hand toward me, completely unaware that I recognized him. My phone rings twice and I see it's Dr. Foreman calling, but I don't answer. She leaves voicemails and I listen to them later. Her voice sounds worried and confused, asking what happened, saying we should talk, asking if I'm okay. The second message says she's really concerned and wants to make sure I'm safe. I listen to both messages 3 times, but I don't call her back because I don't know what to say. If she knew about her father, then she's been lying to me for 6 months. If she didn't know, then I'm about to destroy her whole family. Either way, I can't talk to her right now and maybe not ever again. By morning, I've maybe slept 2 hours in short patches filled with nightmares. I check my email and find an automated response saying Detective Harrison retired 3 years ago. My stomach drops until I read the rest. The message says my email has been automatically forwarded to Detective Randolph in the cold case unit. Less than an hour later, I get a response from Detective Randolph himself. He says he received my email and reviewed the attachments. He wants to meet with me as soon as possible, today if I can manage it. He also asks me not to have any further contact with the Foreman family until we talk. His quick response gives me the first real spark of hope I've felt since I recognized Bob last night. Someone is taking this seriously and wants to help. I meet Detective Randolph at the police station that same afternoon. He's younger than I expected, maybe 40, with sharp eyes that actually look at me like I'm a real person with a real case, instead of some obsessed victim who can't let go. He takes me to a small conference room and spreads out everything I sent him across the table. He reviews my documentation carefully while I sit there trying not to fall apart from exhaustion and stress. He listens as I walk him through the whole thing, from the therapy sessions to the Thanksgiving invitation to the moment I recognized Bob's scarred hand. He takes notes and asks questions, but he never once suggests that my memory might be wrong or unreliable after 20 years. When I finish talking, he looks at me with something like sympathy and says, "This is good work. Really detailed documentation." I almost start crying from relief because finally someone believes me. Detective Randolph explains that while my identification is really strong, they need more than just recognition and a scar to move forward with charges. He asks me detailed questions about my therapy with Dr. Foreman. What exactly did I tell her about the case? Did she ever react strangely when I described the killer or the scar? Did she ask any leading questions or seem interested in specific details? As I answer his questions, I realize with growing sick feeling in my stomach that she knew everything about my case. I described that scar to her probably 15 times over 6 months. I showed her the police sketch in almost every session. She knew I was looking for a tall man with gray hair and a distinctive scar on his left hand. Her father has all those things, and she never once suggested he might match my description. Either she's the most unobservant therapist in the world, or she knew something and didn't tell me. Detective Randolph stands up and walks to a gray filing cabinet against the wall, pulling out a thick folder with my parents' names typed on the label. He spreads the contents across the conference table, and I see photos I haven't looked at in years. Crime scene reports, witness statements, the original sketch I helped create when I was 7. He pulls out my initial description from 20 years ago and reads it out loud. The killer was tall, maybe 6 feet, with gray hair that looked neat and clean. He had a scar on his left hand, jagged like a lightning bolt, running from his thumb down to his wrist. I described how my mother had grabbed a kitchen knife during the attack and managed to cut him before he overpowered her. Detective Randolph looks up at me and asks me to describe what I saw at Thanksgiving. I close my eyes and picture Bob's hand as he dried it with the dish towel. The scar was exactly where I remembered, jagged and old, starting at the base of his thumb and running down toward his wrist. The shape matched perfectly, like someone had traced my childhood drawing onto his actual hand. Detective Randolph nods slowly and says, "This is the strongest lead the case has ever had." He explains that most eyewitness identifications after 20 years would be questionable, but the scar is so specific and distinctive that it gives my testimony real weight. He points out that I described the scar's exact location and shape before I ever met Bob, which means I couldn't have been influenced by seeing him. The height matches too, accounting for 20 years of aging. Bob would have been about 50 when my parents were killed, and now he's 70. Exactly the right age progression. Detective Randolph tells me he believes me completely, and he's going to do everything possible to build a case, but I need to understand how careful we have to be. He leans forward and his voice gets serious. I cannot have any contact with Dr. Foreman or anyone in her family. I cannot approach Bob directly or try to talk to him. Any contact could compromise the entire investigation or put me in danger if Bob realizes I recognized him. If Bob knows we're looking at him, he could destroy evidence or flee. I nod and say I understand, but inside I'm fighting the urge to drive back to that house and confront him. Part of me wants to grab him by that scarred hand and demand to know why he killed my parents, what they ever did to him, why he destroyed my entire life. Detective Randolph seems to read my mind because he says he knows how hard this is. But I've waited 20 years, and I need to wait a little longer to do this right. I promise him I won't make contact, and I mean it, even though every cell in my body wants to scream at Bob until he confesses. Over the next few days, my phone keeps buzzing with messages from Dr. Foreman. The first one just asks if I got home safely from Thanksgiving. Then she starts asking if I'm okay because I seemed upset when I left. By the third day, she's sending longer messages saying she's worried about me and asking if something about meeting her family triggered bad memories. I stare at each message and want to type back that her father is a murderer, that he killed my parents while I watched from a closet, that she's been helping me search for a killer who was sitting at her Thanksgiving table. But Detective Randolph's warning stops me every time. Finally, she sends a text saying she's concerned about my well-being and asking if our session last week triggered something she should know about. I type and delete about 10 different responses before settling on something brief. I tell her I need to take a break from therapy for personal reasons, and I'll reach out when I'm ready. It feels like a lie, but it's the closest I can get to the truth without compromising everything. She responds immediately asking if there's anything she can do to help, but I don't reply. That weekend, I pull out all the boxes of my parents' belongings that I've kept in my closet for 20 years. I go through every photo, every document, every scrap of paper looking for any connection between my family and Bob Foreman. My hands shake as I look at pictures of my parents smiling at birthday parties and holiday dinners, knowing I might finally be close to getting them justice. I find my dad's old work calendar and flip through the months before the murder, looking for any appointments or notes about plumbing repairs. There's an entry from 3 months before they died that just says plumber coming for kitchen sink. My heart starts racing because that could have been Bob. That could have been when he first came to our house and learned the layout. I take photos of the calendar page and send them to Detective Randolph with a message explaining what I found. He calls me back within an hour and his voice sounds excited. He says he's been reviewing Bob's background and found that 20 years ago, he worked for a plumbing supply company that serviced our neighborhood. This means Bob had legitimate reasons to be in the area and would have known the layout of houses like ours. He probably serviced dozens of homes on our street over the years. My stomach drops because this makes it even more real. Bob wasn't some random intruder. He was someone who had access to our home, who my parents probably let in without question because he was there to fix something. Detective Randolph keeps talking and explains the legal challenges we're facing. 20 years means most physical evidence is gone or too old to be useful. My eyewitness testimony as a 7-year-old will be questioned by defense lawyers who will say childhood memories aren't reliable. We need something concrete to build probable cause for a DNA warrant. He suggests I write down every detail I remember about that night, no matter how small, because something might provide a new angle for the investigation. He says to include everything, even things that seem unimportant, because you never know what detail might matter. I spend the entire evening writing, filling page after page with details I've tried to forget for 20 years. The sound of my mother screaming from the kitchen. The smell of blood that filled the house. The way the killer moved through our home like he knew exactly where everything was, not bumping into furniture or hesitating at doorways. The moment my mother grabbed a knife from the counter and fought back, managing to slash his hand before he overpowered her. I remember hiding in the closet with my hand over my mouth, watching through the crack in the door as he gripped the knife with that bleeding hand. I can still see the blood running down between his fingers as he stood over my parents. The writing process leaves me emotionally destroyed, crying so hard I can barely see the keyboard. But Detective Randolph said every detail helps, so I keep going. When I finally finish, it's 3 a.m. and I've written 12 pages. I email everything to Detective Randolph and collapse into bed, too exhausted to even take off my clothes. 2 days later, there's a knock on my apartment door in the middle of the afternoon. I look through the peephole and see Dr. Foreman standing there looking worried. She knocks again and calls my name, saying she's concerned because I missed our scheduled session and won't return her calls. I open the door but don't step aside to let her in. She immediately notices something is wrong, probably because I look like I haven't slept in days. She asks if this is about Thanksgiving, if meeting her family was too much for me. I have to physically grip the doorframe to stop myself from screaming at her about her father. My jaw clenches and I can feel my whole body shaking with the effort of staying calm. I tell her I need space and start to close the door. She puts her hand out to stop it and says we should talk about whatever is going on, that she's here to help. I shake my head and tell her again that I need space, then close the door while she's still talking. I hear her stand there for a minute before finally walking away. That night I decide I can't just wait around for the police to build their case. I need to do something active, something that feels like progress. I search online for private investigators who specialize in cold cases and find Priscilla, who has good reviews and a website full of solved cases. She's expensive, charging $200 an hour, but I've been saving money for years specifically for anything that might help solve my parents' murder. I call her and explain the situation, leaving out the part about recognizing Bob at Thanksgiving because I don't want word getting out. I just say I have a suspect and need someone to verify his background and movements from 20 years ago. Priscilla says she can help, and we schedule a meeting for the next day. When I meet her at a coffee shop, she's younger than I expected, maybe 35, with sharp eyes that remind me of Detective Randolph. She takes detailed notes as I explain about Bob working for the plumbing company and the timeline of events. She says she'll start by verifying his work history and movements 20 years ago, staying within legal bounds but maybe finding things faster than the police. Within 3 days, she calls with her first report. She confirms Bob was definitely working in my neighborhood during the time of the murders. His route included houses on my street, and the plumbing company's records show he did service calls at multiple addresses within 2 blocks of where I lived. She also found something interesting in his employment records. Bob left that job suddenly 2 months after my parents were killed, citing family reasons on his exit paperwork. Priscilla says the timing could be coincidental, but combined with everything else, it feels significant. I immediately call Detective Randolph to share what Priscilla found, and he agrees the timing of Bob leaving his job is worth noting. He says he's building a timeline of Bob's life around the murders, and every piece helps establish opportunity and suspicious behavior. He sounds energized, like we're finally making real progress after 20 years of nothing. 2 days later, Detective Randolph called to say he was meeting with the assistant district attorney to discuss what we'd need to move forward with charges. I asked if I should come and he said not yet, that this was just preliminary strategy. The next afternoon he called back and explained what Dan told him. Even with my identification and Bob's presence in the neighborhood during the murders, they needed something physical to build a prosecutable case. Dan suggested looking into whether any evidence from the original crime scene was still preserved somewhere, because modern DNA testing could extract profiles from samples that were too degraded 20 years ago. Detective Randolph said he'd start checking the cold case storage facility to see what might still exist. That night I couldn't sleep, because every time I closed my eyes, I saw Bob's scarred hand reaching toward me. The next morning at the grocery store, I saw an older man with gray hair, and my chest got tight. My hands started shaking. I had to leave my cart and walk outside to breathe. It kept happening over the next few days. Any man with gray hair or visible scars on his hands made my heart race and my vision narrow. I'd wake up 3 or 4 times a night checking that my apartment door was locked, then checking again 10 minutes later because I couldn't remember if I'd actually checked or just thought about checking. I knew I needed help, but going back to Dr. Foreman was impossible, and the idea of explaining everything to a new therapist made me want to throw up. Instead, I went online and ordered a security system with door sensors and cameras. When it arrived, I spent 6 hours installing it and testing it, then checking the locks again anyway because the cameras didn't feel like enough. Priscilla called while I was checking the locks for probably the 20th time that day. She'd been digging into Bob's financial records and found something interesting. He paid for almost everything in cash and kept a very low digital footprint, which she said could be normal for someone his age who didn't trust technology. But it could also suggest someone who was careful about leaving traces of his activities. She was going to keep looking for any unusual patterns around the time of my parents' murders, any large cash withdrawals or unexplained expenses. I felt this grim satisfaction hearing that we were building the case piece by piece, even though each piece felt tiny compared to what we needed. The next day I got an email from Dr. Foreman saying she'd filed a formal notice that I'd terminated therapy. She offered referrals to 3 other therapists who specialized in trauma and said she hoped I'd continue getting help. Her tone was professional, but I could sense hurt underneath the careful wording, and part of me felt guilty for ghosting her after she'd been so supportive for 6 months. But then I remembered her father's scarred hand drying that dish towel, and the guilt disappeared. She had to have known, or she was dangerously blind to details that any therapist should notice. Detective Randolph called 3 days later with news that made my hand stop shaking for the first time in a week. They'd found preserved evidence from my parents' murder in the cold case storage facility. Swabs from the knife handle and samples from under my mother's fingernails where she'd fought back were still there in sealed evidence bags. Modern DNA testing might be able to extract profiles that weren't possible with 20-year-old technology. He was submitting requests to have everything retested, though he warned me the process would take months, and there was no guarantee the samples weren't too degraded. I thanked him and tried not to get my hopes up too much, but that night I slept for 5 hours straight without waking up to check the locks. The security of actual evidence existing felt better than any security system. I decided to file an ethics complaint against Dr. Foreman for the boundary violation of inviting me to her family's Thanksgiving. Even if she didn't know about her father, bringing a patient into her personal life like that was completely inappropriate. I looked up the state licensing board website and filled out their online complaint form, describing the Thanksgiving invitation in detail and how it violated therapeutic boundaries. Submitting it felt like the only thing I could control right now, and 2 days later the board responded saying they'd investigate and interview both of us. Priscilla called that same week to report she'd identified a potential witness. A former co-worker of Bob's from the plumbing company might remember details about his behavior 20 years ago, around the time of the murders. She was going to approach this person carefully and see what they remembered about Bob during that period. I tried not to get my hopes up, but every new piece of information felt like progress, like we were slowly building something solid. Late one night when I couldn't sleep, I did something stupid that I knew Detective Randolph had specifically told me not to do. I got in my car and drove to Bob's neighborhood, parking 3 houses down from his 2-story colonial with the basketball hoop in the driveway. I sat there for over an hour just watching, trying to make sense of how the friendly grandfather figure who'd offered me turkey and asked about my life could be the same man who'd stabbed my parents while I watched from a closet. The lights were on in what looked like a living room, and I could see shadows moving behind the curtains. After an hour, I forced myself to start the car and leave before I did something that could ruin the investigation, like walking up and confronting him. The ethics board scheduled interviews about my complaint 2 weeks later. I met with an investigator named Mateo at their downtown office. He was maybe 50 with gray hair that didn't trigger my panic response because he seemed so calm and professional. He took detailed notes while I described the Thanksgiving invitation and how it violated therapeutic boundaries. He asked careful questions about the timeline and whether I'd felt pressured to accept the invitation. I explained that while Dr. Foreman hadn't forced me, the power imbalance of the therapeutic relationship made it inappropriate regardless. He asked about my relationship with Dr. Foreman and whether there were other boundary issues. I stayed focused on the Thanksgiving incident and didn't mention my suspicions about her father because that wasn't relevant to the ethics violation. Detective Randolph called the next day to say the DNA retesting had been approved and samples were being sent to the lab. He warned me that even with modern technology, 20-year-old evidence might be too degraded to yield useful results. He also explained that if we did get a DNA profile from the killer, we'd still need a sample from Bob to compare it to, which meant building enough probable cause for a warrant. The legal process felt endless, but I understood it was necessary to do everything right, so nothing got thrown out later on technicalities. Priscilla called me the next afternoon to say she'd tracked down Bob's supervisor from 20 years ago, a retired guy named Frank, who remembered Bob pretty clearly from that time period. She was going to approach this person carefully and see what they remembered about Bob during that period. I tried not to get my hopes up, but every new piece of information felt like progress, like we were slowly building something solid. Late one night when I couldn't sleep, I did something stupid that I knew Detective Randolph had specifically told me not to do. I got in my car and drove to Bob's neighborhood, parking 3 houses down from his 2-story colonial with the basketball hoop in the driveway. I sat there for over an hour just watching, trying to make sense of how the friendly grandfather figure who'd offered me turkey and asked about my life could be the same man who'd stabbed my parents while I watched from a closet. The lights were on in what looked like a living room, and I could see shadows moving behind the curtains. After an hour, I forced myself to start the car and leave before I did something that could ruin the investigation, like walking up and confronting him. The ethics board scheduled interviews about my complaint 2 weeks later. I met with an investigator named Mateo at their downtown office. He was maybe 50 with gray hair that didn't trigger my panic response because he seemed so calm and professional. He took detailed notes while I described the Thanksgiving invitation and how it violated therapeutic boundaries. He asked careful questions about the timeline and whether I'd felt pressured to accept the invitation. I explained that while Dr. Foreman hadn't forced me, the power imbalance of the therapeutic relationship made it inappropriate regardless. He asked about my relationship with Dr. Foreman and whether there were other boundary issues. I stayed focused on the Thanksgiving incident and didn't mention my suspicions about her father, because that wasn't relevant to the ethics violation. Detective Randolph called the next day to say the DNA retesting had been approved and samples were being sent to the lab. He warned me that even with modern technology, 20-year-old evidence might be too degraded to yield useful results. He also explained that if we did get a DNA profile from the killer, we'd still need a sample from Bob to compare it to, which meant building enough probable cause for a warrant. The legal process felt endless, but I understood it was necessary to do everything right, so nothing got thrown out later on technicalities. 3 weeks after that call, Detective Randolph asked me to come to the courthouse because the judge was hearing arguments about the DNA warrant. I sat in the courtroom while Dan presented our case, laying out my identification of Bob, his presence in the neighborhood during the murders, the suspicious timing of him quitting his job and moving, and the co-worker's statement about scratches on his arms. Bob's attorney argued that this was all circumstantial and based on unreliable childhood memories. The judge listened to both sides for over an hour, asking tough questions about the strength of the evidence. When she finally ruled, granting the warrant based on the totality of circumstances, I felt this huge wave of relief wash over me. 20 years of searching, and we were finally going to get concrete answers. Detective Randolph caught my eye and gave me a small nod, but he pulled me aside afterward to remind me that we still needed the DNA to actually match. If it didn't, we were back to square one with nothing but my memory to go on. 2 days later, 2 detectives went to Bob's house early in the morning to serve the warrant. Detective Randolph called me right after to say Bob had complied with the swab collection, but immediately asked for his lawyer. His attorney showed up within 30 minutes, and Bob refused to answer any questions without counsel present. The lawyer made a statement to the detectives calling this a case of mistaken identity based on unreliable childhood memories, but the warrant was valid, and they had the sample. Now came the hardest part, the waiting. The lab technician told Detective Randolph it would take 6 to 8 weeks to process and compare the samples because they were backed up with cases. 6 to 8 weeks felt like forever. I tried to maintain some kind of normal routine, going to work, seeing you, Michelle, for therapy twice a week, but I was obsessively checking my phone every few minutes for updates. Every time it buzzed, I'd grab it hoping for news from Detective Randolph. Every day felt like a year as I imagined finally getting confirmation that Bob killed my parents. You, Michelle, helped me understand that this waiting period was its own kind of torture. Different from the 20 years of not knowing, but just as hard in its own way. During one session about 4 weeks into the waiting period, the ethics board reached their decision about Dr. Foreman. Mateo called me to explain that they'd found she violated professional boundaries by inviting me to her family's Thanksgiving dinner. The board issued a formal reprimand that would stay on her record and required her to complete additional training on therapeutic boundaries before she could return to full practice. She was allowed to keep her license, but this violation would be permanent. I felt satisfied that there were consequences for what she did, though it seemed pretty minor compared to what her father might be facing. Around the same time, Priscilla finished her investigation and met me at a coffee shop to hand over her final report. It was this thick binder documenting everything she'd found about Bob over the past few weeks. The timeline of his movements 20 years ago, maps showing his work route through my neighborhood, copies of employment records showing when he quit, the co-worker's statement about his scratches and stressed behavior, financial records showing when he sold his house. She'd compiled it all into a professional dossier that strengthened our case. She told me she was confident we had the right person, and she hoped the DNA would confirm it. Her certainty helped me get through the endless waiting, gave me something to hold on to when the doubt crept in. Michelle spent several sessions helping me prepare for both possible outcomes. What if the DNA matched and what if it didn't? We worked on coping strategies for either scenario because she wanted me ready emotionally regardless of the results. During one session, I realized something that hit me hard. I'd spent 20 years building my entire life around finding this killer. My whole identity was wrapped up in being the boy whose parents were murdered, the witness who never gave up searching. I wasn't sure who I'd be once this was resolved one way or another. What would I do with myself if we got justice? What would I do if we didn't? Michelle said this was actually a sign of growth, that I was starting to think beyond the case for the first time in 2 decades. About 5 weeks into the waiting period, Dr. Foreman sent a request through Mateo asking if I'd be willing to meet with her in a mediated session. She wanted to apologize directly and explain that she'd never made any connection between my case and her father. I was pretty reluctant because I didn't really want to see her or hear her excuses, but Mateo suggested it might provide some closure for both of us, help us both move forward. I thought about it for a few days and finally agreed to meet in his office with him present as a neutral party. The mediation happened on a Tuesday afternoon in Mateo's conference room. Dr. Foreman was already there when I arrived and she looked terrible, like she hadn't been sleeping. Her eyes were red and she started crying almost immediately when I sat down. She apologized for the boundary violation and insisted she'd never suspected her father of anything. She said if she'd made any connection between my descriptions and her dad, she would have referred me to another therapist right away. I wanted to believe her, but I was also really angry that she hadn't been more careful with all the details I'd shared. I told her that even if she didn't know, she should have recognized that inviting a patient to family dinner was crossing a line. We talked for over an hour and didn't resolve everything, but by the end I felt slightly less betrayed. At least she seemed genuinely sorry and genuinely shocked about her father. 7 weeks after the DNA sample was collected, Detective Randolph finally called. His voice sounded carefully neutral when I answered, which immediately made my stomach drop. He said the lab had finished processing and comparing the samples. The DNA from under my mother's fingernails was a partial match to Bob. It was consistent with him being the person who left that DNA, but the sample was so degraded and incomplete that it wasn't conclusive enough to be certain beyond reasonable doubt. While the DNA didn't exclude Bob, it also didn't definitively prove he was there that night. My heart just sank, because this wasn't the clear answer I desperately needed after waiting 7 weeks. Detective Randolph could hear the disappointment in my voice, and he tried to explain that partial matches have led to convictions before when combined with other evidence. But I knew what this meant. It wasn't the smoking gun we'd hoped for. The next day, I met with Dan at his office to discuss what the partial match meant for the case. He explained that it wasn't enough by itself to guarantee a conviction at trial. Any decent defense attorney could argue contamination, degradation over 20 years, or even coincidental similarity. He said he needed to decide whether to charge Bob based on the totality of all our evidence or wait and see if anything else turned up. He was leaning toward charging him because when you put together my identification, Bob's opportunity and presence in the neighborhood, the suspicious timing of his life changes, the co-workers' observations, and the DNA consistency, it created what he called a prosecutable case. He said juries have convicted on circumstantial evidence before when the circumstances all point in one direction. But he wanted to be honest with me that this wasn't a guaranteed win. There was real risk that a jury might not convict based on what we had. I left his office feeling this weird mix of hope and dread, knowing we were close but not certain we'd get there. The next day, Detective Randolph called and asked me to come by the station. I drove over feeling heavy, like the partial DNA results had taken all the hope out of me. He sat me down in the same conference room where we'd gone through the original case files and pulled out a folder. He started showing me other cases where partial DNA matches combined with witness testimony had led to convictions. He walked me through 3 different murder trials where juries had found defendants guilty based on circumstantial evidence that looked a lot like ours. He pointed to the timelines, the witness statements, the forensic analysis that wasn't perfect, but painted a clear picture. He told me he'd worked cases for 15 years, and the evidence we had against Bob was strong. Really strong. The partial match wasn't ideal, but when you added my identification, Bob's presence in the neighborhood, his sudden job change, the co-worker's statement about scratches and the timing of everything, it created what prosecutors call a compelling narrative. He said juries convict on circumstantial evidence all the time when the circumstances all point the same direction. I wanted to believe him, but 20 years of disappointment had taught me nothing was guaranteed. I'd watched enough true crime shows to know that cases that seemed solid sometimes fell apart in court. I thanked him and left feeling slightly better, but still scared we'd come this far only to lose at trial. That afternoon, Bob's attorney held a press conference that played on every local news channel. I was at home when my phone started buzzing with notifications. I turned on the TV and saw this slick guy in an expensive suit standing in front of microphones. He said his client Bob Foreman completely denied the allegations and maintained his innocence. He called the DNA match coincidental and said the sample was so degraded that it proved nothing. Then he went after me directly, saying childhood memories were notoriously unreliable and that I'd been influenced by 20 years of obsession with finding my parents' killer. He suggested I'd convinced myself Bob was guilty based on a common scar and my desperate need for closure. He said his client was a loving father and grandfather who'd never been in trouble with the law, and this was a case of mistaken identity, driven by a traumatized witness who couldn't let go. I felt rage building in my chest as I watched him tear apart my credibility on television. My hands were shaking, so bad I could barely hold the remote. I called Dan immediately and he could hear how upset I was. He told me to breathe, that this was standard defense strategy, and we shouldn't respond publicly. He said the case would be decided by evidence presented to a jury, not by media statements and press conferences. He reminded me that defense attorneys always attack witness credibility, because that's their job, and it didn't mean the jury would believe them. He said we needed to stay focused on building the strongest possible case and not get distracted by public relations battles. I tried to calm down, but seeing myself portrayed as some obsessed, unreliable witness on TV was harder than I'd expected. Over the next week, Dan reviewed all the evidence and made his decision. He called me in for a meeting and explained that instead of filing charges directly, he wanted to present the case to a grand jury. He said this would give him the chance to present all our evidence in a controlled setting without the defense being able to challenge it yet. If the grand jury found probable cause, they'd issue an indictment, and then we'd move forward to trial. He started preparing me to testify again, this time in much more detail about the murder itself and my identification of Bob. We spent hours going over my testimony, practicing questions and answers, making sure I could walk the grand jury through every moment of that night. He explained that the grand jury process was secret, which meant I wouldn't have to face Bob or his attorneys. It would just be me, the prosecutors, and the grand jurors. He warned me it would be emotionally difficult to relive that night in such detail, but it was necessary to help the jury understand exactly what I witnessed and why I was so certain about the identification. I told him I was ready to do whatever it took. The grand jury testimony was scheduled for 2 weeks out, which gave me time to prepare mentally. You helped me work through the anxiety of having to describe my parents' murder in detail to strangers. She taught me grounding techniques for when the memories became overwhelming. On the day of my testimony, I arrived at the courthouse early. Dan met me outside the grand jury room and went over everything one more time. Then I walked in and saw 23 people sitting in rows watching me. I took my seat and Dan started asking questions. I testified for 3 hours straight, walking them through every single detail of that night. I described hiding in the closet, hearing my mother scream, watching through the crack in the door as the man with gray hair moved through our house. I explained how my mother had grabbed a knife from the kitchen and fought back, how she'd slashed his left hand before he overpowered her. I told them about watching him stab my parents, about the scar I saw on his hand as he gripped the knife, about memorizing every detail of his face because even at 7 I knew I needed to remember. Then I walked them through recognizing Bob at Thanksgiving, seeing that exact same scar, feeling my body go cold with the certainty that this was the man from my nightmares. The grand jurors asked me thoughtful questions about the scar, about my certainty, about whether I'd had any doubt when I saw Bob. I answered every question as honestly as I could, explaining that I'd spent 20 years remembering that scar, and there was no question in my mind it was the same one. After I finished, Detective Randolph testified about the investigation and the evidence they'd compiled. Priscilla testified about the timeline she'd documented and Bob's suspicious behavior. Dan presented the DNA results and brought in an expert to explain what a partial match meant and why it was significant, even though it wasn't conclusive. The whole process took most of the day. I went home exhausted and emotionally drained from reliving the worst night of my life. Then I waited. The grand jury deliberated for 2 days while I barely slept. Every time my phone rang, I jumped. Finally, Detective Randolph called with news. The grand jury had returned an indictment against Bob for 2 counts of murder in the first degree. I started crying right there on the phone, 20 years of pain and frustration pouring out. He told me Bob was arrested right now and would be held on high bail because of the severity of the charges and the risk he might run. His family was still claiming his innocence, but he was going into custody to await trial. I hung up and just sat on my couch crying for an hour. After 20 years of searching, the man who killed my parents were finally being charged. Within hours, the arrest hit local news and my phone started blowing up. Reporters were calling, emailing, showing up at my apartment building. Everyone wanted to interview me about the cold case that had finally been solved after 2 decades. I ignored all the requests because Dan had warned me not to talk to media before trial. But I couldn't help watching the news coverage. They showed Bob's mugshot next to old photos of my parents that must have come from the original case files. They called it a breakthrough in a 20-year-old cold case, a son who never gave up searching for justice. It felt weird seeing my story on TV, seeing my parents' faces on the screen. That week I had a session with you, and we talked about the complex feelings I was dealing with. Relief that Bob had been charged. Vindication that people finally believed me. Grief that was somehow sharper now that justice was actually happening. And anxiety about the trial, about what would happen if a jury didn't convict. She helped me process all of it and reminded me that whatever happened, I'd accomplished something remarkable by getting this case reopened and charged. Over the next few weeks, Bob's attorney filed a bunch of motions trying to get evidence thrown out. He wanted to suppress my identification testimony, arguing it was unreliable. He wanted to suppress the DNA evidence, claiming it was too degraded to be meaningful. The court scheduled pre-trial hearings, and I had to sit through days of expert testimony. Memory experts talked about how childhood memories change over time. DNA experts debated the significance of partial matches. The defense brought in their own experts who questioned everything. But Dan fought back hard with his own experts who explained why my memory was reliable and why the DNA evidence mattered. After weeks of hearings, the judge made her rulings. Both my identification testimony and the DNA evidence would be admissible at trial. The defense could challenge their reliability in front of the jury, but the evidence wouldn't be suppressed. Dan called it a major victory for the prosecution. I felt relieved, but also knew the real battle was still coming. Around this time, Dan approached Bob's attorney with a plea offer. He proposed that Bob plead guilty to 2 counts of murder in the second degree instead of first degree, and in exchange he'd get concurrent 20-year sentences instead of consecutive life terms. The attorney took the offer to Bob but came back saying his client refused. Bob was maintaining his innocence and demanding a trial. Part of me felt disappointed because a plea would have meant certainty, no risk of acquittal. But another part of me wanted him to face a jury and be publicly convicted for what he did to my parents. I wanted 12 people to hear all the evidence and declare him guilty. The trial got scheduled for 4 months out, which meant more waiting. I tried to focus on living my life instead of obsessing over the upcoming trial. I kept seeing you regularly, and she helped me understand that regardless of what a jury decided, I'd already accomplished something important. I'd given my parents a voice after 20 years of silence. I'd fought for them and gotten their case reopened and charged. That mattered whether or not we won at trial. I started trying to build a life beyond this case, making plans that weren't centered on finding my parents' killer. It was hard but felt necessary. One day I got an email from Dr. Foreman. She said she was sorry for everything that had happened and that she'd cut off contact with her father. She said she believed me and hoped I got justice, but she was also dealing with the pain of learning her father might be a murderer. She said she understood if I never wanted to speak to her again, but she wanted me to know she was thinking of me. I read the email twice and then closed it without responding. There was nothing left to say between us. Our relationship as therapist and patient was over, and I needed to focus on the trial ahead. I appreciated that she believed me, but I couldn't carry her pain on top of my own. I had to focus on getting through the next 4 months and preparing to face Bob in court. 3 months passed in a blur of preparation sessions with Dan. We met twice a week in his office, going through every detail of my testimony until I could recite it in my sleep. He played the role of the defense attorney, asking hostile questions designed to shake my confidence and make me doubt my own memories. The practice was brutal but necessary. He warned me that the defense would try to suggest I had been coached or that my memory was unreliable after 20 years. We worked on staying calm when questioned, acknowledging what I wasn't certain about while maintaining confidence in what I knew for sure. The scar, the face, the way he moved through my house that night, those details had never wavered. Dan taught me to pause before answering, to think carefully about each question, to avoid getting defensive or emotional even when the questions felt like attacks. By the time the trial date arrived, I felt as ready as I could be, though my stomach still twisted with anxiety every time I thought about facing Bob in court. The trial started on a Monday morning in late March. I sat in the courtroom gallery during jury selection, watching 12 strangers get questioned about their ability to be fair and impartial. It took 2 full days to seat the jury and 2 alternates. Then came opening statements. Dan stood before the jury and told them about a 7-year-old boy who watched his parents get murdered, who hid in a closet, and saw every detail of the killer's face and hands, who carried that memory for 20 years until a chance encounter brought him face to face with the man who destroyed his family. He walked them through the evidence they would see, the witnesses they would hear from, the DNA results that supported my identification. Bob's attorney countered by talking about reasonable doubt, about how childhood memories fade and change over time, about how a partial DNA match wasn't proof of anything. He suggested I had become so obsessed with finding a killer that I convinced myself Bob was guilty based on a scar that thousands of people might have. The jury listened carefully to both sides, their faces neutral and unreadable. My testimony started on Wednesday morning and lasted 2 full days. Dan walked me through that night step by step, asking me to describe what I saw from the closet, how my mother fought back, how the killer moved through our house like he knew the layout. I explained recognizing Bob at Thanksgiving, the moment I saw his scarred hand, and knew with absolute certainty it was him. The direct examination was difficult but manageable because Dan and I had practiced it so many times. Then came cross-examination, and it felt like getting attacked. Bob's attorney suggested I had spent 20 years building a fantasy about finding my parents' killer, that I was so desperate for answers, I latched onto the first person with a scar on their hand. He asked if I had ever seen other people with hand scars and mistaken them for the killer. I stayed calm and explained that this wasn't just any scar. It was distinctive and specific, jagged and running from thumb to wrist in a pattern I had drawn for police sketches 1,000 times. He asked how I could be sure my memory hadn't changed over 2 decades, if I might be remembering the police sketch instead of the actual killer. I looked directly at the jury and told them I had nightmares about that scar for 20 years, that it was burned into my brain, that seeing it on Bob's hand was like looking at a photograph I had carried in my mind my entire adult life. The jury seemed sympathetic, several of them nodding slightly as I spoke, but I couldn't tell if they believed me. Detective Randolph testified next, walking the jury through the investigation and every piece of evidence pointing to Bob. He explained how Bob worked in my neighborhood 20 years ago, how he had opportunity and access to houses like ours, how he left his job abruptly 2 months after the murders. Priscilla took the stand and presented her findings about Bob's suspicious behavior and life changes right after my parents were killed. The DNA expert spent hours explaining the partial match from under my mother's fingernails, why it was significant even though it wasn't complete, how it was consistent with Bob being the contributor, but couldn't definitively prove it due to sample degradation. Bob's former co-worker testified about seeing scratches on Bob's arms around the time he quit. Scratches Bob claimed were from work, but the timing matched my mother's defensive wounds. Dan built a strong case piece by piece, showing how everything pointed to Bob, even though no single piece of evidence was conclusive on its own. The prosecution rested after 5 days of testimony, and I felt cautiously hopeful that the jury had heard enough to convict. Bob testified in his own defense, which surprised me because Dan had said most defendants don't take the stand. He sat calmly in the witness box and claimed he had no memory of ever meeting my parents, that he serviced dozens of houses in that neighborhood over several years and couldn't remember specific addresses. He admitted the DNA could be his, but suggested it was coincidental, that he might have had innocent contact with my mother at some point during a service call. He said he left his job because his wife was sick and needed him home more, that the scratches were from plumbing work in tight spaces. His testimony was smooth and practiced, his voice steady and reasonable. But I watched the jury studying his left hand as he gestured, their eyes drawn to that distinctive scar over and over. His attorney tried to make him seem like an innocent grandfather being wrongly accused, but I could see doubt in some of the jurors' faces as they compared his hand to the photos of my police sketches displayed on screens around the courtroom. Closing arguments happened on a Friday afternoon. Dan walked the jury through every single piece of evidence one more time, asking them to consider the totality of what they had heard. A distinctive scar that matched perfectly. Opportunity and presence in the neighborhood. Suspicious behavior and life changes right after the murders. DNA consistent with Bob being the killer. And most importantly, a 7-year-old boy's memory that had never wavered in 20 years. Not once, not ever. He reminded them that circumstantial evidence is still evidence, that they didn't need a confession or perfect DNA to find someone guilty beyond reasonable doubt. Bob's attorney spent 2 hours arguing reasonable doubt, attacking every piece of evidence as insufficient or unreliable, suggesting the prosecution was asking them to convict based on childhood memories and coincidences. He told the jury they couldn't send a 70-year-old man to prison for life unless they were absolutely certain, and the evidence didn't support that level of certainty. The jury got the case at 4 p.m, and the judge sent them home for the weekend, telling them to begin deliberations Monday morning. Those 3 days of waiting were torture, worse than the months leading up to trial because now it was completely out of my hands. The jury deliberated for 3 full days. I spent those days in a conference room near the courtroom, unable to eat or focus on anything except waiting for news. Dan warned me that a long deliberation could mean they were struggling to reach agreement, but it could also mean they were being thorough and careful. Every time my phone buzzed, I jumped, thinking it was the call saying they had reached a verdict. Finally, on Wednesday afternoon, the call came. The jury had a verdict. I rushed back to the courtroom, my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. Everyone took their seats and the judge brought the jury in. The 4 women stood and the judge asked if they had reached a verdict. She said they had. The clerk read the charges and asked for the verdict on count 1, murder in the first degree. Guilty. Count 2, murder in the first degree. Guilty. I broke down crying right there in the courtroom, 20 years of grief and rage and frustration pouring out as the word guilty echoed in my ears. Bob showed no emotion as the verdict was read, just sat there with his hands folded on the table, but I saw his family crying in the gallery behind him. The judge thanked the jury and scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks out. Dan put his hand on my shoulder as I sobbed, telling me we had done it. Justice had finally been served. I couldn't speak, could barely process that after 2 decades of searching, Bob had been convicted of killing my parents. Sentencing day arrived 2 weeks later, and I had prepared a victim impact statement. The judge allowed me to speak before imposing sentence. I stood at the podium and looked directly at Bob as I talked about how his actions destroyed my childhood, how I spent 20 years haunted by nightmares, and consumed by the need to find him, how he stole my parents from me and left me alone in the world at 7 years old. I described the therapy, the sleepless nights, the constant fear that he would never be caught and my parents would never get justice. My voice shook, but I made it through the entire statement without breaking down. Bob stared at the table the whole time, never once looking at me. His attorney asked for leniency based on Bob's age and lack of prior criminal history, suggesting concurrent sentences would be appropriate. Dan argued for the maximum, pointing out the calculated nature of the crime, the fact that Bob had evaded justice for 2 decades, and the devastating impact on me and my family. The judge took less than 5 minutes to decide. She sentenced Bob to 2 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole, saying the brutal murder of 2 people in their own home combined with 20 years of evasion warranted the harshest penalty available under law. Bob was 70 years old. He would die in prison. As the bailiffs led him away in handcuffs, I felt a weight lift from my chest that I had been carrying since I was 7 years old. After the sentencing, I drove to the cemetery where my parents were buried. I hadn't visited their graves since the trial started because I wanted to wait until I could tell them it was over. I knelt between their headstones and told them that their killer had finally been brought to justice, that Bob had been convicted and would spend the rest of his life in prison, that I had never given up on them and never would. I cried as I spoke, but they were different tears than before. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it wasn't mixed with helpless rage and frustration anymore. I had done everything in my power to get them justice, and I had succeeded. They could rest now. I could rest now. I stayed at the cemetery for over an hour, just sitting with them, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't experienced since I was 7 years old. The trauma would never completely go away, but it had transformed into something I could carry without it consuming me. My next therapy session with you focused on processing everything that had happened and thinking about what came next. She asked me how it felt now that the trial was over and Bob was in prison. I told her it felt strange, like I had been holding my breath for 20 years and could finally exhale. But I also felt lost because I had spent my entire adult life defined by being a victim and a witness, by searching for my parents' killer, and now that was done. I didn't know who I was when that wasn't my primary identity anymore. You said that was completely normal, that I had spent so long focused on one goal that reaching it left a void I would need to learn to fill with new purposes and relationships. She encouraged me to explore interests I had neglected while consumed by the case, to build friendships and maybe even romantic relationships, to think about career goals beyond just surviving. The idea of having a future not centered on the past was scary, but also exciting. For the first time in 20 years, I could imagine building a life that wasn't defined by what Bob had taken from me. 3 weeks after the sentencing, I found a cold case advocacy group that met downtown every Tuesday night. I walked into my first meeting and saw about 15 people sitting in a circle, all of them carrying the same kind of weight I'd been carrying for 20 years. The facilitator asked if anyone wanted to share, and I raised my hand before I could talk myself out of it. I told them about my parents, about the 20-year search, about recognizing Bob at Thanksgiving dinner. When I finished, a woman across the circle started crying because her sister had been murdered 18 years ago, and the case was going cold too. After the meeting, she asked me how I kept going, and I told her exactly what Detective Randolph had told me, about documenting everything and never giving up. Over the next few months, I became a regular at those meetings, sharing my experience with DNA evidence and court procedures, helping families understand what to expect from the legal system. It gave me something I hadn't expected, a way to turn all that pain into something useful for other people. 6 months after Bob's conviction, I'm sitting in a coffee shop filling out an application for the State University's criminal justice program. My nightmares went from every night to maybe once a week, and when they come now, they're different. Less about helplessness, and more just memories I can wake up from. I have actual friends now, people from the advocacy group, and a few co-workers who invite me to things, and I actually go instead of making excuses. Last weekend, I went to a barbecue and laughed at stupid jokes and didn't think about murder once. I still visit my parents' graves every Sunday and tell them about my week, about the families I'm helping and the classes I'm planning to take. The grief lives in me, but it doesn't run my life anymore. I got them justice, and now I'm building the kind of life they would have wanted for me, one where their memory means more than just the way they died.